Everybody, my name is Jules DeVasto, and I'm going to be presenting on the clinical issue of gender dysphoria. This is a topic that is really important to me as someone who is transgender and someone who was a trans youth going through this. So before we dive into gender dysphoria, first off, we have to talk about what is gender. So this right here is the gender unicorn, which is used to kind of break down some of the different aspects of both gender and sexuality, which sometimes get conflated. So first off, there is gender identity, which is how a person identifies, how they see themselves, which is widely accepted to be who a person is. You know, if someone tells you who they are, believe them. This can be very different from what is just underneath that, which is gender expression, which is generally considered like how a person shows up in the world, how they look, how they are perceived sometimes by others. Um, and there are a lot of reasons why someone's gender expression might not match their gender identity. Many times it could be because they're not ready to be out of the closet yet. They're not ready to fully express their gender in the way that they would like to, or it could be a matter of safety. They're not in a position where they have the opportunity to express their gender in the way that they would like. Sex assigned at birth, which is that third category down. This is something that is sometimes widely considered what gender is, even though that is not accurate. This is where the doctor looks at your genitals when you are a baby and decides based on what they look like, what you are, a male, a female, or someone who is intersex, who has qualities of both male and female genitalia. There is also at the very bottom a bit about sexuality of who you're physically or emotionally attracted to. That's not so important for what we're going to be talking about today, but it is something that is good to know. All right, so gender dysphoria. This is a marked incongruence between one's experienced or expressed gender and their natal gender, sex assigned at birth, of at least 6 months in duration, as manifested by at least two of the following. A marked incongruence between one's experienced or expressed gender and primary and or secondary sex characteristics, or, this is important for us, in young adolescents, the anticipated secondary sex characteristics. If you're not familiar, secondary sex characteristics are things like facial hair, breasts, things that are not your genitalia that might physically mark you as a gender. Another characteristic that is a criteria for this diagnosis is a strong desire to be rid of one's primary and or secondary sex characteristics because of a marked incongruence with one's experienced or expressed gender, or in young adolescents, a desire to prevent the development of the anticipated secondary sex characteristics. A strong desire for the primary and or secondary sex characteristics of the other gender, a strong desire to be of the other gender, or some alternative gender different from one's designated gender, a strong desire to be treated as the other gender or some alternative gender different from one's designated gender, and a strong conviction that one has the typical feelings and reactions of the other gender or some alternative different gender different from one's designated gender. A little bit about the history of this specific diagnosis. I don't want to get too far into this, but this is something that has had many different iterations and names throughout the DSM. Because trans people make up a small percent of the population, I think they have been othered and treated differently for a very long time. And a couple things I do want to point out on this slide are some of the terms that still sometimes get used today, but are considered to be derogatory towards the trans community, which are specifically transvestitism and transsexualism. So calling someone a transsexual, calling someone a transvestite, not considered to be politically appropriate at this time. A few stats about this community. First, unfortunately, 81% of trans people, so a majority of trans people, have thought of committing suicide. And in that population as well, about half, 42%, have attempted suicide. So this is a very vulnerable population with increased need when it comes to mental health. I think it's important to note, especially considering our current political sort of atmosphere, that states that have passed anti-trans laws aimed at minors and young adults saw suicide attempts by trans and gender nonconforming teenagers increase by as much as 72% in the years after the legislation passed, according to a new study by the Trevor Project. To me, this speaks to the fact that social stigma and whether or not a person is accepted by society has a lot to do with how they will do in terms of their mental health. The Child Mind Institute said that young people who are transgender or trans feel powerfully that they wish to be or are a different gender from the one they were assigned at birth. They not only want to dress and act and be accepted as the other gender, but may feel extremely uncomfortable in their bodies. Some, though not all, trans people want to change their bodies through hormone therapy or surgery to align with their gender identity. Just to kind of drive home the point a little bit further, on the left, we have sort of a percentage of those adolescents who had clinical range scores for just general emotional problems, and those youth who identified as trans far and away were in the lead, with about 33% having clinical range scores for emotional problems, as compared to about 22% of cisgender adolescents. That number drops pretty dramatically when it comes to trans adolescents who are taking puberty blockers, meaning that they are receiving gender affirming care. And the same can be seen on the right when it comes to those adolescents who have expressed suicidal thoughts, those who had not started treatment, pretty high up there, and those who were taking puberty blockers actually scored about the same as those who are cisgender, meaning not trans. So identifying at-risk youth for gender dysphoria can be incredibly difficult because of this social stigma. If you look at the chart that I have all the way over to the right, only about 25%, it says 26.4%, are out to all of their family. So that's about 1 in 4 trans youth are out to all of their family, a majority of them not out to anyone, or out to very few people. And just to give you a further idea of just some of the atmosphere that kids are dealing with who are trans, I have some statistics as well from the Pew Research Center saying that most favor protecting trans people from discrimination. However, there is a growing share of people who say that gender is determined by sex at birth, which these two things are kind of incongruent, where, you have people who say that they don't want people to be treated badly, but then their beliefs express that they don't really see another person as being who they are. When it comes to gender dysphoria and families, parents and families of trans youth have a lot that they're up against. Trans youth themselves are up against a lot. Oftentimes, parents will grieve the loss of who they expected their kid to be. They have a very real fear for their child's safety. They will be battling their internalized bias and their own transphobia, confusion, and lack of understanding as to what all of it means. Many fear getting it wrong and not knowing really what they're talking about when it comes to gender. And they can also face conflict with other family members about how best to support the child. This can also mean ostracism from their community, especially if that community is very religious or conservative. They may be unsure of how to support their trans child in public spaces like bathrooms. And it's also, they're trying to support their child while navigating very complex healthcare decisions, legal processes like name change, dealing with things like unsupportive schools, bullying, and harassment. So when it comes to transgender students and school, only about 3% of US high school students identify as transgender, but among that population, about 1 in 4 experience violence at school. And also 1 in 4 miss school for safety concerns. 7 out of 10 feel sad or hopeless. And to me, this really drives home the point that we need to be making sure as counselors that we do our best to institute policies that really address these things. On the left, you'll see some of the things that transgender and cisgender youth experience at school, with this chart showing that far and away, majority of these things are experienced by those who are transgender or questioning. So outcomes for youth with gender dysphoria are, again, largely relative to the level of social acceptance and gender affirming care that they experience. There was a study from Stanford Medicine which said that trans people who began hormone treatment in adolescence had fewer thoughts of suicide, were less likely to experience major mental health disorders, and had fewer problems with substance abuse than those who started hormones in adulthood. The study also documented better mental health among those who received hormones at any age than those who desired but never received the treatment. Unfortunately, I can't do this population justice without also mentioning some of the darker things, which is that because this is a vulnerable community, it is one that is also targeted. 321 trans and gender diverse people were reported murdered recently. 80% of those being Black, brown, or racialized, really driving home the need for intersectional approaches to this work. 48% of those people were sex workers. A lot of the times, people in this community become sex workers out of necessity because of things like homelessness. 94% of those who were murdered were trans women or femmes, 45% migrants or refugees. 28% of these murders were on the street, and 26% were murdered in their residence. But when it comes to treatment options for gender dysphoria, my biggest recommendation would be for gender affirming family therapy. I think that counselors and therapists who are assisting transgender youth and their families should first begin by providing a lot of psychoeducation, especially driving home the pivotal role of family acceptance in long-term outcomes for youth, and provide space and resources for family members to express the emotions that arise from learning that their child is transgender. They need to have a space separate from their child where they can grieve, who they thought their child was going to be as opposed to who their child is. And I think counselors and therapists should also really be prepared to offer resources when it comes to navigating legal and healthcare systems in their area. This is going to be different depending on where you are. Here in Massachusetts, we're very fortunate that we have a lot of resources, but there are those national resources that are out there that can help with this. When it comes to play therapy and gender dysphoria, I think that play therapy could be incredibly beneficial for trans youth, especially those who are experiencing gender dysphoria, regardless of their age. I found a resource out there that said that in the playroom, transgender and non-binary children might choose to experiment with gender through play, perhaps by dressing up in costumes or using toys to represent different aspects of themselves. The therapist's acceptance and support of this expression allow the child to feel seen and understood, which can be deeply affirming. This freedom helps children explore their gender identity in ways that feel safe and validating, contributing to a more positive sense of self. This can look like letting someone who is assigned as male at birth play with dolls or dress in dresses. But that can be very deeply healing, I believe, for folks in that situation. Some resources that are out there that are national and even international for youth experiencing gender dysphoria as well as their families. First and foremost, I always recommend Trans Lifeline, which is an organization that has both a website that you can get to as well as a phone number you can call in order to get services and support for those who are experiencing suicidal ideation, who may not be in a safe place where they can be themselves and need support sort of navigating that situation. There is also a really great resource called PFLAG, which is Parents and Families. It is traditionally of lesbians and gays, but it's really for anyone sort of in the queer community, and they have a lot of really great resources to support families, to support parents, and help them to understand sort of what it means to be trans, what people who are trans are up against, and just sort of all things in terms of supporting families. They have groups that people can attend, numbers for people to call, lots of really great resources there. And last is Point of Pride. This one is more recent, but this is an organization that helps trans people, especially trans youth, to raise money for gender affirming surgeries, gender affirming hormone replacement therapy. They offer free binders for people, free gaffs, feminizing shapewear, really a lot of things that are there for folks to feel more at home in their bodies, especially when they're experiencing dysphoria. So really great resource there. And then I think my key takeaways that I really want people to walk away with are that, again, as counselors, it is our duty to be informed and prepared to support at-risk populations. This is a population that is at a very increased risk for mental health troubles. So it's really important that we are informed and aware of how to support them. And again, oftentimes the most critical determining factor in a trans adolescent's mental health is the support or lack thereof that they receive in affirming their identity. And this doesn't necessarily need to be a parent or a family member. Sometimes it could be a staff member. It could be one adult in their life who sees them as they are, accepts them as they are. And that is incredibly powerful. And that is, I think, what I hope we all can be for the youth that we take care of one day. Here are my references. And thank you so much for listening to me speak. Appreciate y'all.